Thanks for having me, everyone. Good morning. I recently read this book and I finished it like January 3rd, and I've been talking to all my friends about it ever since. So I am one of those very intrusive and loud and obnoxious book nerds that when I learn something cool, I want to share it with everybody as soon as possible. Um, so this is a book that's about the neuroscience behind love, and it's got a lot of very practical tips for building stronger, more fulfilling connections across a range of relationships. So the book itself tends to focus on romantic love and romantic relationships, but you can actually take a lot of what's in it and apply it to all sorts of relationships across your life. It doesn't necessarily have to be romantic. There's a much broader field of study on attachment theory. And surprise, surprise, so many of the neurological insights about human connection ladder up with what Emily was sharing earlier. So once again, we've kind of like paired in terms of interests on the things that make humans work. And so let's take a look at some of our insights. So first thing is that everyone has an attachment style. And I really appreciated what Emily shared about those connection needs being even before our physical needs, because it's true. So they've done a range of studies on children to find out what children's attachment styles were. So essentially they would have a child play in a room and a parental figure of some sort was watching, and then the figure would get up and leave the room. And there were three different main styles that children would kind of go through when that happened. So there were kids who would stop playing and start crying, and that is the anxious attachment style. There were kids who would keep playing, but when they looked at the kid's physiology, that kid was as nervous as the anxious kid, but wasn't engaged in what they call protest behavior, which is essentially your attachment system kind of activating and reaching out for something that you need at that like sociological level. And then there was secure attachment, kids who could keep playing and actually mean it and felt secure enough in their relationship with their parental figure that when the figure left and then came back, they were able to kind of balance that and feel fine. And so everyone has an attachment style. And where this book in particular comes from is specifically the looking at it in adults. So this has been like fairly common in children's psychology. I guess the turning point here was actually looking at, does this carry into adulthood? And if so, how? And so that's kind of how this book was born. Let's take a look at the next point. So this is one of the things that Emily was really talking about that I think is really great, which is that humans are interdependent by design. So essentially, like as a child, you bond with your parents and with other, figures in your life. And there's a ton of really cool studies that are cited in the book. But one of them that was really interesting was that on a physiological level, they've done studies where they put somebody in an MRI, show them like some scary images, and then try to soothe that response by having either their partner's voice or somebody's voice in a different room kind of playing through the MRI, and then physical hand holding while they looked at different like stressors on that person. And people who had a secure attachment style and had their partner there were able to more effectively reduce their physiological stress sooner. And so it is just like a really cool thing to see that humans are social by default. And actually like this is something that's built into the way that we're designed. And so one of the other really interesting things was there's some emerging theory about why humans have these different attachment styles. And one of the big ones is secure attachment is really attached to like community building and doing some of what Emily does at work, which is communities of practice, right? And so community building and being clear and having like a secure attachment style can be part of like bringing people together and articulating needs and setting boundaries. And then the anxious attachment style actually has its own benefits, which are to be hyper aware of danger. You know, when you think about what living on the plains a couple 100,000 years ago meant versus now, like people who were hyper aware of danger could alert everyone else. So, you know, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And then avoidance typically tend towards independence. So, you know, people who were more independent could like spread the population and try new living scenarios, et cetera, right? So this is actually like, there's a ton of cool studies in there about how humans are physiologically interdependent, like regardless of anything else. And I think one of the cool things that this touched on was like, we have this like mythos of codependency, and like there is a truth to it, but there's also a lot of like myth to how we think about codependency in society. And it's not a bad thing. One of the things that I took away was dependency is not a bad word, right? And so that's really, really fascinating to think about, like, actually your body just does this. So how do you do that in a healthy way? And that's really what this book is about. And it was really cool. Let's take a look at our next insight. Okay, so this was one of the big things that I think is fascinating. So essentially, the anxious attachment style is probably one that we recognize. There's the meme of like the crazy ex-girlfriend, right, with the big eyes and like, you know, why are you ignoring me? I texted you 3 seconds ago. Do you not love me anymore? That sort of thing, right? So that's like the stereotypical anxious attachment style. But they go through this anecdote, and you know, these are pulled from real studies and interviews that they've done. And if you work in tech at all and you like user research or anthropology, like this is definitely a great book for that, because these are real case studies. And it's okay, you can keep typing in the chat. I don't care. I'm not the police. So the spark that some of us tend to feel, like when a relationship feels quote unquote boring, could actually be your attachment system activating, because you have an anxious attachment style and you gravitate towards people who have an avoidant attachment style. And this actually happens a lot. So, you know, they tell the story of one person who had a string of like really terrible relationships, but then got really bored with like a very secure relationship because it was missing that quote unquote spark. And so one of the big takeaways for me was like, oh, some people can actually like mistake like their anxiety for like passion, because they spend a lot of time thinking about the relationship and worrying about it and investing in it and like trying to make it work and trying to get it right. But actually like that quote unquote spark, or that like mulling and kind of ruminating, can actually be a sign that like you're not dealing with your own internalized anxiety really well. They have again, for those who like love consulting or work in tech, like they have a good 2x2 of how this works. And so there's avoidance, high or low, and then there's anxiety, high or low. And so high avoidance, you know, like, do you avoid intimacy with others? So if you think about intimacy, and then are you like very intimacy open or intimacy avoidant? And then anxiety, are you like focused on the behaviors of others and the relationship? Do you spend a lot of time like worrying about the relationship? Or you just kind of like work through things as they come? And so if you're low anxiety, low avoidance, you have what they call a secure attachment style. And if like the further along you move, the more you have other styles. Let's take a look at our next insight. So I totally blew through this a little bit, but the really interesting thing about the avoidant one is these people tend to say that they are fine and independent and whatever, but like actually they all need the same level of connection. It's just that when that intimacy starts to creep up, it causes anxiety in them, and so they try to find ways to push people away. So for example, I was out with a friend the other night and we were on a walk, because keep your social distance, kids, wear a mask, get vaccinated. So we were out on a walk and she was telling me how ready she is for a relationship. And one of the really interesting things about that was how she's not necessarily prioritizing people who are emotionally available for the things that she needs. And so as we were talking about this, I was like, hey, you should read this book, Attached. I'm actually giving a talk on it later this week, but it's really interesting because I think despite you saying that you really want like a loving emotional relationship, like look at the people that you're choosing to try to be with, they're not emotionally available to you. And so you're kind of designing yourself for failure kind of from the beginning, right? And so how do we at least like bring some awareness to this and talk about the ways in which maybe you need to have a healthier relationship with your own self and with like what you think you want and what that might look like for you. And then the other big thing, last thing, is I think this is one of the things that this book is just a little bit older. So it's interesting how attachment theory has evolved since this book was written, because it takes a very static approach and it, it can be very like Myers-Briggs or anything else, right? All models are broken, some models are useful. So don't get overly attached to your attachment style. It is fluid. It is something that can change and can depend on your behavior. So if you think about like, you might be really secure at work, but really anxious in your personal life, right? Or it could just depend on the other people that you interact with. And so one of the things that I think is really important is like, as you think about this book, try not to think about this as like a static category that can't change. This is actually one of the really awesome things in the book is they talk about very practical interventions. So if you have an anxious attachment style and you kind of approach like loving relationships and dating or anything else with a scarcity mindset, and you're like, I have to find that one person. And the only way that I'm going to make this work is to find that one person. And like you overinvest in like finding that one person. One of the stories in the book is actually about a person who they suggested just start dating more as a way to build confidence. And that person did, and it worked really well for them because they were able to, over time, like learn an abundance mindset by going, oh, there are lots of people that find me attractive. There are lots of people that are interested in who I am as a person. And so that built that confidence that was able to then have other impacts in their life and helped them find ways to like mitigate some of the most toxic insecurities that they were carrying around for themselves. So it's a tool. All models are broken, some models are useful. The neuroscience is really fascinating. Whether we actually know everything that there is to know is kind of like TBD, but don't just read this book and kind of sit on it. Like read this book and like expose yourself to some other things in the broader field because it's really, really fascinating, super cool. And like, yeah, everyone has attachment styles. Go find yours.